I'm delighted today to be joined by Mr. Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Mr. Gao, thank you so much for joining us today on what is a very critical period and window for China, of course, and the world. So thanks for joining us today on Halftime Talk.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you. Let's start with the topic of the hour, of course, which is the whole tariff scenario, emanating in principle out of the US, of course, and then watching the world respond and react. How disruptive do you think this has been to a country like China, which is a major importer and exporter, of course, of many things? How disruptive so far, and how do you see China managing these negotiations going forward?
Thank you very much for having me. What President Trump and his administration have launched is a global trade war, global tariff war, not only against China, but against almost all the other relevant countries in the world, even including an island where only penguins live. Now, this war is absolutely wrong war to launch. It is highly disruptive. It is basically throwing all the rules of the game out of the window, destroying open trade, free trade, etc. And I'm pretty sure this war will not achieve the declared goal of President Trump and his administration of moving manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Now, as far as China is concerned, China is doing the right thing to defend open trade, to defend the international order as it should be, rather than allowing any country to hold a gun at the head of the world and demand it to kowtow, to yield to its pressure, etc. On the other hand, China is also sizing up the economic losses that it will sustain in this massive trade war. After all, China and the United States are two of the largest trading nations in the world. Their bilateral trade at the height were about 800 billion US dollars, on the verge of going to about 1 trillion US dollars. Of course, in China-US trade, there is huge imbalance. US runs a huge trade deficit. China runs a huge trade surplus. But this is not what we want it to be. We want to have a more balanced trade. But the United States refuses to sell many things China has a big market for example, tech products, high-tech products, digital products of all kinds. So I don't think China is to be blamed. The United States is to be blamed for this imbalance. And both countries really need to work very hard to make sure that China-US trade become more balanced for mutual benefit. But this kind of maximum pressure doesn't get any mileage as far as China is concerned. China will continue to fight till the end to make sure that the US gets the point that they cannot just trample upon open trade, free trade, as they are doing right now, and they need to suffer the consequences.
How important do you think that is in this negotiation part between China and the US going forward? The US debt issue and the fact that China has been holding so much of it because of its export strategy, obviously, initially.
Now, I would say the Trump tariff war against the rest of the world has already caused disruption and high volatility for the stock market, the bond market, the currency market, and the job market eventually, many other areas. And the American people will suffer the consequences. Now, as far as the U.S. bond is concerned, I don't think the United States is in a sustainable position as far as this 36 trillion US dollar federal bond is concerned. Sooner or later, it's going to explode into one of the largest, if not the largest, financial crisis hitting mankind. When that will be, I do not know. Actually, part of the desperate acts that Trump administration is engaged in, for example, launching trade war, try to force other countries to buy the so-called Mar-a-Lago 100-year U.S. bond, for example, is part of their desperate attempt to avoid this incoming imminent financial crisis. However, someone really need to advise President Trump that you cannot have the cake and eat it. Because we know ever since the United States abandoned the gold standard and shifted to a paper dollar, without the backing of gold, the United States dollar, the US dollar, has been the dominant currency in the world up to today. And by logic, the United States is supposed to run a trade deficit, because you either have the trade deficit and the US dollar dominance, or you have trade balance, for example, or trade surplus without US dollar being the dominant foreign currency. But if you want to have the two at the same time, have the cake and eat it, you run into this logical dilemma, I think. So I think either President Trump deliberately disregards this particular logic problem, or they have some other goals to pursue, using the trade deficit as the camouflage.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's a lot of his policies and announcements, at least, defy a common logic so far.
And many people say, well, China, are you worried about losing the US market? I say, we don't care. Why? Because eventually, America should care about being locked out of the China market. And by then, the United States will vigorously knock on Chinese doors, saying, let me in, let me in, let me play a role in the China market. China doesn't care. China cares about doing the right thing. That is free trade, open trade, free market, etc. This is why we are faced with this historical moment of truth. China becoming the standard barrier of free trade, and the United States wants to destroy free trade by launching the maximum trade war against the rest of the world. Let's buckle up and let's see what's happening as we speak.
Mr. Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, thank you so much. It's been a delight to have you on Halftime Talk and get the China viewpoint on all these very pertinent global issues. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor.